My name's Graham Mexon. I'm Pro Vice-Chancellor for Research and Knowledge Exchange at the University of Westminster. And I'd like to welcome you all to one of the Westminster talks. We have a very interesting speaker today, but you're very welcome if you're outside the university. And if you're inside the university, well done for supporting the series. We're obviously going to hear from our lecturer. There'll be time for question and answers. And then I think there's a little reception in the foyer if you want to stay along after that. But without further ado, let me introduce Geoff Mulgan CBE, Chief Executive of Nesta, the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, which is an independent charity supporting innovation in the UK. Over the course of his career, Geoff has led various roles in UK government, including the Director of the Government Strategy Unit and Head of Policy in the Prime Minister's Office. Geoff is a Chief Executive of Nesta, as I said. He's also been Chief Advisor to Gordon Brown MP and a lecturer in communications, an investment executive and a reporter on BBC TV and radio. He's also a visiting professor at LSE, UCL, Melbourne University, and is a regular lecturer at the China Executive Leadership Academy. He is an advisor to many governments around the world and has been a board member of the Work Foundation, the Health Innovation Council, Political Quarterly and the Design Council, and chair of Involve. You can also find, if you look on his website, a reference to a number of books he's wrote in these various areas. But today, Geoff's topic is collective intelligence and the future of the university. And I cannot resist the pun that universities are supposed to be intelligent places, but they're not always collective in the way that they design things. So I look very much forward to hearing how you see collective intelligence could influence the future of universities, particularly in the sort of market-driven environment that we find ourselves in the future. So, Geoff, over to you.
Well, good evening, and thanks very much for being here. I am here because quite a long time ago, I used to be based in an office just over the road with various people in the room I just saw, working then on telecommunications and networks and this thing which didn't actually even have a name then, but was the internet, which seemed likely to come along and perhaps do some interesting things. So what I'm going to talk about this evening is not, as it were, a classic sort of academic lecture where I'm going to tell you lots of entirely digested thoughts. I'm going to share some work in progress, and I'm going to end with a question as much as an answer, but hopefully a question which all your bright brains might be able to offer some pointers to answers on. Before I start, I thought I might just find out who you all are and what disciplines you come from. So can we just have a quick show of hands? Who is from a computer science or sort of ICT background in the room? Data? Nobody, okay? Yeah, oh, one, okay. Sort of business studies, anything like that? Quite a few. Sociology, other social sciences? Nothing? Anyone know nothing? Or be an entirely independent? History? Any other vital sort of characteristics anyone would like to share? Architecture, okay. Good. Well, as I say, I will talk fairly broadly, and I may say some slightly challenging things about universities, but this is meant to be a prompt for a discussion and a dialogue rather than a monologue. So I'll go quite quickly through rather a lot of slides, if I can get this to work, which I can't. Which way should I point it? That way? No. Maybe I should. Do I need to stand here? Or what would make this actually work? Okay. Well, I'm technologically challenged, so I will. Maybe I should just talk, which might be easier anyway. What I was going to kick off was just telling you very briefly a little bit about the organisation where I work, which is Nesta. We were originally a bit of an offshoot of government, a foundation funded out of lottery money. And then in its wisdom about 2 years ago, the government made Nesta an independent charity with its endowment. And what we work on nowadays is is promoting innovation for the public benefit, but in quite a few different ways. We have a side of our work which is very much focused on investment, making technologies work. Is this, maybe just the batteries run out, you never know. A side of it which is running quite practical experiments, innovation programs in the health service, in schools, in public parks, local authorities. A side which is about research, much more like a university research department, developing new statistical tools, analyzing patterns of economic change, and an increasing spread of work around the world, from China and Malaysia to Brazil, Colombia, Europe, US, and so on. For those of you from a business background, actually, I would greatly encourage you to read something we put out about a week ago, which is feeding into a big report next week on patterns of growth of high productivity companies in Britain at the moment, which is showing quite worryingly that actually the prospects for high productivity firms to grow seems to have deteriorated in the last decade or so, and appears to show quite a major allocation problem of the economy. So that's very quickly what Nesta does: research, a lab, investments, and skills. And these are the sort of things we work on through the sort of innovation spiral, from generating ideas to growing ventures. You might have heard of the Longitude Prize, which we ran earlier this year, which with the BBC, we got the public to vote on priority challenges for innovation, and antimicrobial resistance came top. We now host a thing called the Behavioural Insights Team, which was part of government, called the Nudge Unit, which experiments with different ways of encouraging behaviour change. We run a thing called the Alliance for Useful Evidence, working on orchestrating evidence in many fields and getting it into government, and all sorts of other things. And as I said, we work all over the world with partners from the UN to big foundations like Rockefeller to China and Malaysia. I thought I'd just focus on three, before I get into the meat of my talk, three sort of new ways of generating knowledge we've been involved in just in the last month, just as an illustration of what we do. So this was launched about 2 weeks ago, a thing called the Innovation Growth Lab, which was a response to the fact, which some of you who study business may have noticed, that if you ask what is the evidence for how a government or a city can do these things, increase innovation, support high growth entrepreneurship, accelerate business growth, there is almost no evidence at all. There's lots of people who will claim to be experts, but you ask them, how do we know if you're right or you're wrong? They can't tell you. And that's mainly because the ways in which business support has been organized all over the world has not been done in a way which allows you to find out whether your policies work or not. Very different from health, where if you're trying to introduce a new drug, you test it with a control group and you find out if it works or not. So my colleagues had the simple idea of creating a lab which would test policies to do these things with control groups to find out if they actually work. And our hunch is we'll find that most policies, often very expensive ones in these fields, are not very effective. And we brought together partners from the US, Denmark, Netherlands, Australia to fund that. A second example of a new kind of knowledge generation, again, just in the last few weeks, was a map we did of the UK games industry. And this is interesting because it was an attempt to combine different kinds of knowledge. The official government surveys on sectors, which turn out to have no category for games. Indeed, all government statistics face backwards. They reflect the past, and they reflect often the quite distant past. And we try to combine that with open data and web scraping the web to see evidence for startup games companies, where they were, how many people they were employing, turnover, etc. So we think this is a new new way of doing statistics, which will become much more common, especially for high growth fields, emergent fields around technology, the creative economy, and so on. And it includes very detailed maps of London and games companies around areas like this and their growth over the last 20 or 30 years, if you're interested. And then a final example is a new kind of knowledge generation which really annoys some people in universities, which is a do-it-yourself tool for randomized controlled trials. Randomized controlled trials are used in many fields and cost a huge amount of money. And we thought, why not put one on the web, which anyone could run their own RCT. If you're a lecturer here at the university, you can try something out on your classes and get other lecturers to try something else out and get a semi-scientific result as to whether it works or not. So 3 very different kinds of approaches to knowledge. What I really want to talk about, though, is this, or sort of this. That's a picture, I think, from Oxford University. And this is in some ways a sort of the image of the classic university. Somewhere there's a wise professor talking to these slightly disreputable-looking students. Most of them seem to be drinking, actually, at the moment. But you get the idea. And what interests me is what's happened to the university as a place, a sort of repository of intelligence, and as a place which is meant to help a city, a society, to be smart, to be intelligent about its options. And what I'm going to focus on are these sort of related questions, which all of you will have views on. How do groups or societies think? What tools or technologies do they use? How would we think about universities differently if we thought about them as part of systems of collective intelligence? And what are some of the tools which a university like this, or you in your own lives or businesses or whatever, might use, and their implications? And I say I'm not going to offer you definitive answers to these questions. I don't think there are any, but I hope to at least prompt a discussion about some slightly different ways of framing the results. And I'm going to start with 2 or 3 very different examples of collective intelligence in practice. Do any of you work on studying the IPCC by any chance? So the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is probably the world's most ambitious ever attempt to harness the wisdom, the intelligence of thousands and thousands of climate scientists, to look at models and forecasts and vulnerabilities, and then to link it into, a discussion of politicians and so on what should happen on climate change. Brilliant example, pure reason dealing with the most profound challenges facing humanity. Have any of you seen the 10-minute video from Spiegel of the Copenhagen summit in 2010? It should be required viewing in any university for anybody, and it is deeply depressing. It shows what happens when the world leaders, and there's Obama and Sarkozy and so on, got together to try and make decisions based on the IPCC recommendations. This was the last time they did it, and this probably sums up roughly where they got to. No decision, no agreement, all of that sophistication just falling away in the heat of the moment. So we have things like the IPCC, which in one version are pointers to a future where the world really harnesses its brain power in much more systematic ways, and in other respects, examples of total failure. What about this one? Any of you familiar with polymath? Any mathematicians in the room? So this was an interesting thing set up a couple of years ago by one of the Fields Medal winners at Cambridge, who just said, in dealing with really complex mathematical problems, what happens if I post the problem on the web and try to orchestrate a community of other mathematicians around the world to solve the problem? And polymath has been a really interesting example now of apparently much faster solutions to the most complicated problems simply by getting the academic mathematician to move away from doing it all on his own in an attic or a study, and thinking of this as a networked process. And both the solutions and the iterated problems turn out to be much more interesting than the ones which start off. So in a sense, the opposite extreme from IPCC, this is sort of pure theory, again, new tools of orchestrating intelligence. Chess, I think, is the other really live example. Any professional chess players in the room? Any amateur chess players in the room? Quite a few. Well, in the world of chess, I think I chose the wrong picture there, really. You can play on your own, you can play against computers, but the two most arguably interesting things happening in chess at the moment are freestyle chess, where players play supported by a computer, and usually freestyle chess beats either people on their own or computers on their own. And the other method which has been developed just in the last 5 years is, again, players playing in a community, even voting on moves, where the structured deliberation of a community, even if their average skill at playing chess isn't very good, together becomes the level near a grandmaster. Now, here again, I think chess is a metaphor for sort of new ways of organizing intelligence on large scale, which are different from what anyone expected a generation ago. I think then they'd have expected either it would all be done by robots, or they might have thought it would still be essentially down to the brilliance of the very most eminent professors in places like this. Instead, we're seeing these hybrids, freestyle, networked models, outperforming the alternatives. So questions which interest me really flow from these two paradoxes. The first is what I call the paradox of dumb institutions full of clever people and clever machines. And I'll give two examples. One is the US Congress. The US is a country with more intellectual capacity than any other in human history. The most brilliant scientists, universities, companies are awash with technology, and yet almost everyone who comments on US government now says this is one of the stupidest systems in the world. It's an extraordinary sort of dumbing down process happens in terms of what decisions they make, whether it's the midterm elections last week or responses to climate change. So how do we understand that? And the other, of course, is in the city. In this city of London, the institutions which had spent most on intelligence-enhancing tools in the last 10, 20 years were in the City of London, the big derivatives, hedge funds, investment banks, and so on. And of course, 7 years ago, they acted in the most extraordinarily dumb ways, losing vast sums of money, making catastrophic errors, far greater than almost any other institutions in the city. So how is it that we get this sort of mix, and what can be done about it? How do you get institutions and the ways they use technology to smarten themselves up rather than to dumb themselves down, as some of our most prestigious institutions do? And it relates then, I think, to the paradox of universities. Universities are devoted to knowledge, but most universities, the tools they use for knowledge are not very different from 20 years ago, not that different from 50 years ago or 100 years ago. They're things like the research project, the peer-reviewed journal, degrees, PhDs. And to me, the greatest sort of paradox of universities is they do research and development to almost every other field, pharmaceuticals, nanotech, you name it, but almost no R&D is done on universities themselves. And by R&D, I mean, well, what would any of you think R&D means? I think it usually means developing hypotheses, testing them, measuring what works, and drawing conclusions. That's how medicine works, and science works, and particle physics. I've found almost no examples of this happening in relation to the work of the university itself. The central institution, or should be, of collective intelligence in the 21st century, but not applying its very best methods to its own work. And that's at a time when the repertoire of tools are multiplying. So what I'm briefly going to go through, and I'm going to go quite fast, I hope, is just very quickly what some of the tools are. And then I hope to have a conversation about, if you were starting a university, University of Westminster or anywhere else, now, are any of these tools relevant? Are they all irrelevant? What would the design task be if you were the equivalent of the forebears who created this institution, or even the forebears, the Freemasons who built this room with its rather wonderful slogans on the windows? So here we go. Actually, first of all, just a little bit of theory before I dive into the examples about what I found some useful ways of thinking about the components of intelligence, and again, what you might expect in an institution. Here are just a few of the ones which you can see at an individual level, but also you can see in any institution, like a faculty, a department, a charity, a business. It's the ability to observe, to see things which are relevant. It could be sounds, smells, data. The ability to focus, the ability to think and reason, some capacity to imagine, to create, to innovate, some capacity to remember the past, some capacity to judge, nearly always in conditions of uncertainty, and some capacity to be wise. These are the things we look for as signs of intelligence, and as I said, the dumb institutions with clever people often are quite good at this, but lousy at this. And one of the ways of thinking, I think, about the role of the university, almost in any discipline, will include some combination of these capabilities, whether it's sociology or physics. So that's the first sort of little bit of just theory to keep in mind. The second one is perhaps the more traditional way of looking at some of the same things, which thinks of any kind of intelligence, again, from a business to a charity, as having a hierarchy where you start off with data, through information to knowledge to judgment and wisdom. And here it's very easy to automate and routinize, and we've got a huge proliferation of tools out there allowing us to organize data much more systematically than in the past. The further up this hierarchy you go, the more time you need, the more energy you need, and the harder it is to automate. And technologies are so far penetrating a little bit up to here, tiny bit up into judgment, hardly at all into wisdom, unless any of you tell me otherwise. So we've got this sort of strange amplification of the lower ends of the kind of intelligence hierarchy, and sometimes displacing these capacities to be wise and judge. And the paradox is the institutions which have most of this capacity seem most at risk of being dumb when it comes to here. The NSA is another great example of that. Probably more hardware than any other institution on earth, but pretty incapable of thinking through with wisdom how its actions might be interpreted in the rest of the world. And then a third bit of theory is to think about levels of intelligence in a more kind of recursive way. This is just a version of what's, in some ways, a sort of standard feature of any thinking about thinking. That some thinking we do is sort of first order, problem solving, cognition, analysis, etc. We value, though, the ability to reflect on goals and means, so that if something isn't working, if you're trying out a method of thought and it's not working, you then try and generate new categories, new ways of thinking. And then third order thinking is the ability to reflect on your capacity to reflect and adapt. And again, the great traditions of the greatest universities are the ones they've prided themselves on doing all three of these. Having the critical capacity to reflect on reflection, to reflect on goals and means, and not just to, in a linear, instrumental way, use thinking tools. So if you can sort of park some of those, I'm going to very quickly go through some current examples of technologies and tools for intelligence before looping back to the question of the university. So quite fast. Lots is happening, and some of you will be very aware of this, in machine learning, natural language processing, changing everything from what we can do with these sensors on our hands to semantic data, so you can analyze, the Twitter commentaries in a market to predict when it's about to go up or go down, through to machine learning, IBM's Watson machine, playing chess, playing Jeopardy, and all sorts of tools of linking these to distributed problem solving, like the chess and maths examples. We've got a proliferation of new research tools, some of which are completely opening up the way research is done. One of, I think, the nicest current examples is Zooniverse, which is a citizen science project involving, what does it say there? Nearly 1 million people taking part at any one time in solving scientific problems. Almost unthinkable 10 or 20 years ago that you might open up even very complex problems to the whole world in such a radical way. At Nesta, we do quite a lot around these kind of challenges and prizes, which in some ways are the same spirit. So the Longitude Prize, which we're going to announce the details of next week, which will be around antimicrobial resistance, anyone, anywhere in the world will be eligible to win that prize, but only if they can demonstrate that their solution works. And this is almost the opposite method to the traditional research funding method of universities and research councils, where you get the money based on your past record, your eminence, or indeed Nobel Prizes, which do the same. This says anyone can get the prize so long as what they suggest actually is effective. And we've used the same principle for things like open data, challenges, and many others. I think there's another sort of strand of very rapid evolution around how you organize intellectual resources. And a university in some ways is just a collection of intellectual resources. This is a very low-tech version from South London, again, a Nesta project where we work with librarians to encourage the public to put their book collections on the library database so that the library can greatly expand its collection of books without buying lots of books. And then if you want to borrow, I don't know, Malcolm Gladwell's Blink, you may find someone in your street has a copy, and so you go and knock on their door and you borrow the book from them and you've made a new friend, or they may turn out to be a monster and you never want to see them again. But this is a new way of thinking about intellectual resources. And all over the country, universities are beginning to share their libraries with public libraries, which is one step. This is several steps further. Or what about things like Patients Like Me? This is an organization which brings together people with long-term health conditions, like diabetes or MS. They come together to support each other, share knowledge, but also to do essentially scientific experiments and data collection on themselves. They become a kind of research department, but not in a university. And as you see, nearly 250,000 users, 2,000 conditions, a really dramatic change in the way knowledge and intelligence is organized there. Smart Citizen, another one we've been working with, Nesta, based in Barcelona, is a similar principle which encourages people to have their own air quality environmental sensors and then to aggregate the data worldwide. You can't quite see the maps there, but there are now thousands of people around the world being smart citizens, generating real-time environmental data and creating what's a sort of bottom-up alternative to official data. And this is particularly powerful in countries like China, where the official air quality data turned out to be wrong. So again, it's a sort of research knowledge orchestration method, but happening almost entirely outside the traditional institutions. There's a sort of overlapping family of innovations on organizing useful knowledge. So if you are, any of you in this room are about to start a new nation or a new government, you can now go on to Constitute, where you can find all the world's constitutions to read, search, and compare, and you can cut and paste and write your own constitution, if you like. Now that's obviously not something we do every day, but it's one of the better things which has come from google.org, but it's quite a useful way of orchestrating what was otherwise rather impenetrable knowledge. Cisco's planetary skin, I think, is another attempt, it didn't quite work, at another version of that with the theory was all across the world there would be sensors of land, oceans, and so on to create, as it were, a planetary brain for mapping the state of the biosphere, spotting disasters, etc. At Nesta, we've been working on what we call a health knowledge commons, which is trying to do something similar for health knowledge and integrating the formal knowledge of the clinical world, the doctors, etc., with the sort of more informal knowledge of patients who often know more about their own condition, more about disease management, and trying to think through how do you integrate clinical, scientific, experiential, and emergent knowledge into a single system. And ideally, making that system accessible on a smartphone, so if you are a patient with MS or your partner you can quickly access the world's best knowledge about what the appropriate choices and actions might be. And a very similar sort of small scale thing, which I've been a bit involved in, called Action for Happiness. And this was a very simple idea of putting in one place the best available knowledge on how to be happy, or how to make your school happy, or your workplace happy. And if you go on Action for Happiness, which now has people from 142 countries on it, and the Dalai Lama is our patron, you can find, again, evidence-based knowledge about everyday things about how to improve well-being. Orchestration of knowledge, making it useful. Action for Happiness has one member of staff. So it's a completely different model of organizing knowledge to those which were prevalent a little while ago. I think I'll jump over all of this. Maybe say a little bit about sort of learning tools. So I'm going to say a bit more later about MOOCs. One of the things which slightly surprises me about universities is how uninterested some of them are in what's known about learning. Some are very interested, I'm sure this one is, but some others around the world don't look at it, look at the lessons from learning. And how in particular do you integrate the technology-based learning, things the Open University has been doing for 50 years, with face-to-face? How do you embed theoretical knowledge with daily practice? This, to me, is one of the best examples, which is in India, Digital Green, which essentially works with farmers on a combination of online videos and tools with study circles. They've relearnt the lessons of the Open University from 50 years ago, the lessons which all of the current generation of MOOCs have ignored. And as a result, this one works, and nearly all the MOOCs don't work. A very different example we've been working on is a thing called Make Things Do Stuff, which is trying to open up tools for young people to create apps or websites or robots. And if you're interested, look at this site, which has a whole series of tools. The learning innovation I mainly wanted to mention, though, was this one, which is a thing called studio schools, which probably no one in this room has heard of, but which was originally an idea for universities, which started with the simple sort of question of what might we do if we were inventing universities from scratch, which would learn from fields like medicine or law, or indeed the military, where the university education integrates work and learning. To be a doctor, you have to not just learn to be a doctor, you have to be a doctor. And it's very interesting how some of the professions integrated work and learning, and other versions of the university completely separate them out. We couldn't get it up and running for universities, but have done for schools. So there's now there will be 50 schools open now in the UK, and the first schools opening in South America next year and India, which have applied this model to secondary education. So the teenagers, this is the Liverpool Studio School, which works very closely with the computing and gaming industry. And from the age 14 onwards, these students are designing real games, working with real businesses on real marketing plans, business models, and so on, and not surprisingly finding that a lot more motivating than sitting in a classroom learning in the traditional way. And the curriculum model here, which you probably can't quite read, but is not English, maths, science, history, and so on. It's communication, relationships, enterprise, thinking, emotional intelligence, and so on. That's the core of the curriculum, and the projects, the real-life projects with businesses and others, are all built around that, and, as it were, the assessment assesses on things like, say, self-understanding, understanding others, ability to plan and execute new ideas, etc. Radically different method. But, as I say, this was done in secondary schools, not in higher education, even though, one could easily imagine a university having exactly the same approach. With all the poppies on Tower of London today, I thought I'd mention memory as well. I think we're in a period of fascinating innovation around how memory and history is organized. This is one which Nesta backed, which was History Pin, trying to really crowdsource memories, photographs, poems, etc. of the First World War, and almost turning the museum from a place with walls into an orchestration of the memory of a whole society. And I think we're going to see many, many more innovations of that kind. We do a lot on tools for innovation. Again, just one example from many is Kaggle. Many of you know Kaggle. So Kaggle is another of these sort of prize-based companies. They set challenges like, can you come up with an algorithm which will predict maybe pupils' exam results in a year's time? And if you can prove your algorithm is better than the alternatives, you get a cash reward, which might be $20,000 or $30,000. And nearly all of their winners are not in established institutions. Many of their winners come from Mongolia or the outer reaches of Ecuador and so on. Again, it's a different way of orchestrating brain power at a global scale focused on practical problems. And finally, one of the things we're quite interested in and we're working on at the moment in Nesta is how do you actually involve the public in decision-making, not just in solving maths problems or science problems and so on. And in 2015, we're going to be working with a number of both political parties and parliaments across Europe on the use of online platforms to engage the public in decision-making. One of the examples of this is in Finland, the Open Ministry, which is already working with the parliament, so any citizen can propose legislation, comment on it, adapt it. Iceland, Reykjavik in Iceland is the other place which has one of the best models in the world. And amongst political parties, we're working with a party called Podemos in Spain, which is now it's a new party, but which is actually in the lead in the opinion polls in Spain, has come out of the Indignados movement. Huge fertility around the world in how to think about democracy, how to think about parliaments, how to think about parties. Nearly all of them different ways of asking the question, how do you mobilize brain power, intelligence, knowledge to get better decisions? None of the answers yet quite mature, but they are moving fast, and they certainly make many of our existing institutions look a bit dead. So final question then is how to link this to the options for universities. And my semi-rhetorical question is how many of these are central to university strategies? There are some things which are definitely pointing in interesting directions. If that was where I started, the image of sort of Oxford in the Middle Ages, and in a way that model, it's slightly unfair, has replicated all around the world. That is NUS in Singapore, i.e. the classic university with campuses, lots of green fields. The University of Westminster doesn't have quite so many green fields, but essentially, a bounded institution with the standard repertoire of degrees and PhDs and research programs. Around the world, there are lots of very different alternatives. So, let's say the OU, nearly 50 years on, still going strong. Aalto University in Finland, a really interesting example of much more project-based, interdisciplinary university. A lot of universities for other ages. Britain pioneered the University of the Third Age, where old people teach other old people, and it's the most elite version of that is the Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative, which you go to university after 50. There are things like the peer-to-peer university, which, like the U3A, is peer-to-peer learning. And this is one I just saw last week from Oxford, which is open innovation in the university around drug development. So there's certainly quite a lot going on in terms of new models of orchestrating knowledge in some universities around the world. If we look at sort of most of our work around innovation, again, there's also a lot of change happening. These are some of the classic sort of 19th and 20th century models of innovation where you had a big lab, that is Bayer in Germany, Bell Labs in the US, which were these sort of almost fortresses packed with brilliant scientists coming up with semiconductors and all sorts of other things. And now we have all these other things, user-based innovation in things like extreme sports or service innovation or open innovation with Linux or social innovation with Muhammad Yunus, design-led innovation in Apple. Very different models of organizing knowledge, but very much part of the modern economy, even though most governments are still spending most of their R&D money here, not on this side. My question, though, is, so how systematic is that? And to go back to where I started, what would a more systematic R&D method look like for collective intelligence and the university? You heard me say earlier my skepticism on MOOCs, things like Coursera, Udacity, and so on. As you'll know, you may know, these have completion rates well under 7%, I think, in most cases. I think they've nearly all burnt through all their money very quickly. They've ignored almost all the lessons of evidence about what works in learning, so it's not that surprising they're failing. But what's intriguing is, why did this happen? It's clear that the internet and digital technologies have huge potential to transform almost everything that happens in an institution like this. And yet, most of the money has gone into models which were almost doomed to fail from the start because they ignored all that had been learnt about learning. And I think that tells us something about the R&D, the collective intelligence system, about collective intelligence, that it's weirdly missing some vital parts. And I think you can see the answer if you ask this question. So imagine somebody here, or in another university, comes up with a really brilliant breakthrough in how to do research or how to do teaching. What then happens? Probably nothing. If you did the same in other fields, someone will pick it up. There'll be a system into which to put your innovation. It will be assessed, it will be measured, it will be compared to other things, and if it really does work, probably money will flow to you, it will be taken up, adopted, etc. Strangely, in higher education, it's almost random whether ideas spread. And this has been particularly a problem with, often not very well digested thoughts from management studies, which often spread around universities devoid of evidence, but more because of fashion. And I think the true challenge of innovation in higher education is not so much coming up with ideas, because academics are brilliantly creative. It's designing a system which ensures that when they do come up with brilliant ideas or adopt some of the ones I showed earlier, the new collective intelligence tools, they are properly absorbed, adapted, and put to work. And so a very final point, and this has been really crystallized for me this year in working on the other side of the world in Tsinghua, which is China's probably top university, where the president of Tsinghua, who has a background in environmental sciences and is quite a systems thinker, has been trying to work on exactly this problem quite explicitly and asking what would an R&D function look like in the heart of a university. An R&D function which might experiment with new disciplines or disciplinary hybrids, which might experiment with new forms of knowledge generation like open labs or accelerators or what have you. And next year, we, as Nesta, will be launching with them as a new part of Tsinghua University to try and explore in practice how do you apply the R&D method to universities, and which of those many technology tools, these tools for thought, are actually ready to be imported back into the university. Tsinghua gets 1,000 applicants for every place, and the aim is to put some of the top, both undergraduates and graduates there, into this program for reinventing the university. But I want to end, as I said at the beginning, with a question, because I really don't know the answer to it. But I think it's a pretty important question to ask in a university. What kind of university does most to enhance the intelligence of the city or nation it serves? London, and this may not be a fact you're familiar with, I don't think it's a widely known fact, London has a higher proportion of its population are graduates than any other world city, by quite a wide margin, far more than New York, Paris, Tokyo, and so on. And London is almost unique in the number of top universities it has in one city. Well, it is unique in the number. And the UK is still fairly unique in the caliber of its universities globally. So we should care about this question, and it slightly worries me that I really don't know the answer to it. So it's on that note I will end and ask for your answers.